cocaine, heroin, amphetamine, all of the nicotine, alcohol, all of the drugs of abuse induce these types of plastic changes, and they do them in what's called the mesocortical limbic reward circuit, which involves the ventral tegmental area, which has all those dopamine neurons, which send projections to the nucleus accumbens, which has the receptors for those dopamine releasing terminals. The prefrontal cortex is also part of that circuit. And that sort of sex, drugs, and rock and roll circuit is thought to be what's the brain regions that are involved in normally encoding reward-based learning that's constrained by certain rules. Whereas when drugs of abuse like cocaine and amphetamine and heroin take over, they kind of usurp those functions and do them in a accelerated way.
I see. So not all plasticity is good plasticity. And in fact, all drugs of abuse share this property of causing plasticity in the so-called sex, drugs, and rock and roll circuit, which is basically a part of the VTA to the accumbens. And it's a dopamine circuit, so dopamine is very important. There's some plasticity that happens here, hyperplasticity, and that's a critical part of what the addiction process is in the brain.
That's right. And and importantly, it also involves the prefrontal cortex, because there have been some people who have, made a big deal about sort of what psychedelics might be doing, and they focus on the prefrontal cortex, not realizing that the prefrontal cortex is also part of this sex, drugs, and rock and roll circuit that drugs of abuse also impact.
I see. So maybe, roughly speaking, people can imagine the nucleus accumbens kind of in the middle-ish of the brain. You've got one circuit from the VTA pumping dopamine in that's sort of coming up from behind it. And then the prefrontal cortex, right behind your forehead, is sort of sending information in the other direction. And those two streams are colliding. And the way that they mix together is very important for all this stuff.
Almost. That's right, but also the dopamine neurons send projections to the prefrontal cortex directly, and there's reciprocal connections between all of these things that are much less studied. So we like to, when we make textbooks, we draw arrows and we make it seem like it's all going in one direction, but these brain regions are really talking to each other in a pretty substantial way. And actually, one of the other things that although it's not what I'm necessarily most well known for, one of the big discoveries that I made when I was still a trainee and a postdoc is that the nucleus accumbens also receives a pretty important serotonergic input from another brain region called the dorsal raphe, and that type of reward learning is a little bit sort of there's beginning to be more evidence that type of rewarded learning is also involved in encoding the reward value of other rewards like social rewards that are not as often implicated in drugs of abuse, but may also play a role there.
So yeah, the brain is super complicated. There's lots of connections, lots of molecules involved. Not all plasticity is good plasticity. We just talked about that in the context of addictive drugs. With all of that in mind, now there's something kind of interesting about psychedelics, because on the one hand, they're famous for not really being drugs of abuse. They don't really have addictive properties like cocaine or amphetamine or nicotine or other things.